Stolen technologies of the Third Reich, behind-the-scenes games of Soviet designers, and a fighter that literally burned itself up in mid-air. How did the USSR, in just a few months, create an ultimate monster piercing the sky at an insane speed of 800 kilometers per hour? Today, our hero is the Yak-15. Why did this steel beast tear apart aerodynamic conventions while ruthlessly melting its own fuselage? And who actually stole its title of the very first by mere hours before takeoff? I have dug up details that Soviet parade chronicles shyly kept silent about. I recommend watching this video until the very last second. At the end, I will reveal the shocking truth about this aviation Frankenstein. Let's not delay. Let's begin. Spring of '45. Imagine an airfield somewhere in the west of the Soviet Union. Early morning. The smell of oil and wet grass. Mechanics in greasy overalls tinker with planes. This is the Yak-3, the best Soviet fighter of its time. Light, maneuverable, fast. Pilots adore it. It went through all of World War II and never failed. And now, a pilot climbs into the cockpit. Starts the engine. A characteristic roar, alive, strained, almost human. The machine shudders. The propeller accelerates to invisibility. A beautiful picture, familiar, correct, and completely obsolete. Right at this moment. Here is the question that starts our story. Why did the world's best piston fighters, planes that had been honed and perfected for decades, suddenly become obsolete in practically a year? Not a decade, a year. To understand this, we need to grasp one thing: how a plane with a piston engine flies in general. I'll explain simply. A piston engine is, in essence, a very complex pump. It burns fuel, pushes pistons, the pistons turn a shaft, the shaft turns a propeller. The propeller paddles air backward, the plane flies forward. Logical, understandable, reliable. But this scheme has a ceiling. Literally. The higher the plane flies, the less air there is around it, and the propeller needs air to create thrust. Less air, less thrust, less speed. At an altitude of about 8 to 9 kilometers, a piston plane begins to suffocate. And there is a second ceiling: speed. By the mid-40s, the best piston fighters were accelerating to 700 kilometers per hour. That is the limit. Beyond that, the air starts behaving strangely. Shock waves appear, control worsens, and the structure experiences monstrous loads. Engineers all over the world hit an invisible wall. And here, a completely different principle enters the picture. A turbojet engine works differently. No pistons, no propeller. Air is sucked in from the front, compressed, mixed with fuel, ignited, and bursts out the back with tremendous force. According to Newton's third law, the plane flies forward. The stronger the stream behind, the faster the movement forward. Imagine holding an inflated balloon and letting go of the neck. The balloon flies in the opposite direction. That is the jet principle. Only instead of a balloon, tons of metal. And instead of air, scorching gases. And here's what is important. This principle does not depend on air density as critically as the propeller. At high altitudes, a jet engine loses power significantly less. And most importantly, no speed limitations in the lower range. 800 kilometers per hour, please. 900? Possible. That invisible wall simply vanished. By the spring of '45, several countries already understood this in theory. But only one country managed to translate the theory into metal, into mass production, into real aircraft. That country, Germany. And here is where the most interesting part begins. Because the answer to how the Soviet Union stepped into the jet age lay not in Moscow laboratories, not in secret institutes. It lay in the ruined shops of German factories, among the wreckage, soot, and abandoned documentation. May of '45. Soviet engineers and military specialists moved through the territory of defeated Germany. Their task: to find and take out everything valuable. Machine tools, documentation, equipment samples. This was called reparations. In simpler terms, trophies. And among everything they searched for, there was one priority. One object for which special search groups were created: jet engines. Germany at that moment was the only country in the world that had managed to launch jet aircraft into mass production. Two types: the Heinkel HE-278 and the Messerschmitt Me-262. Both flew. Both were faster than any piston fighter, and both used engines from the Junkers Company, model Jumo-004. Soviet specialists found what they were looking for in factories, at airfields, in test centers. Engines in varying degrees of preservation. Documentation. Living German engineers who agreed to cooperate. All this was carefully packed and sent to the East. Let's figure out what exactly they found. What is the Jumo-004, and why was it so important? This is an axial flow turbojet engine. Sounds complicated. I'll explain simply. Imagine a long pipe. In the front part, several rows of fan blades that suck in and compress air. In the middle, a combustion chamber, where fuel is fed and ignition occurs. In the rear part, more blades that are spun by the hot stream and in turn spin the front fans. All this is one continuous process. Air entered from the front, fire exited from the back. The plane flew forward. The Jumo-004 developed thrust of 890 kilograms force. For comparison, the best piston engines of that time developed power that cannot be directly compared with thrust, but in practice, accelerated the plane to a maximum of 700 kilometers per hour. The jet engine allowed breaking this boundary. The Soviet Union made a decision, not to reinvent what has already been invented. Take the German engine, study it, master the production, and use it as a basis for our own developments. A pragmatic decision, a fast decision, and a decision that saved years. The engine received the Soviet designation Reactive Engine 10, abbreviated RD-10. Mass production was deployed in Soviet factories. It would seem that's it. The engine exists, the technology is studied, production is launched. You can build planes. But here's what no one initially considered in full measure. The Jumo-004, and along with it its Soviet copy RD-10, were engines with one very unpleasant peculiarity. They worked with huge thermal stress. The temperature of exhaust gases at the exit reached values at which ordinary structural materials simply could not withstand. The Germans in their planes solved this problem with a special arrangement of engines, under the wings, on pylons, far from the fuselage. The hot stream went to the sides and down, not touching the structure. Soviet designers had to figure out how to place this red-hot unit inside a new Soviet plane. And here began a real puzzle. Because one designer already knew the answer, or thought he knew. And his solution was so unexpected that his colleagues at first could not decide. Was it genius or recklessness? Stalin already knew who to call, and the call did not keep itself waiting. Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev in 45 is not just a designer. He is a man institute, a man system. He is 39 years old. Behind him, a series of fighters that the country knows by name. Yak-1, Yak-3, Yak-9. Light, mean, fast machines. Frontline pilots loved them for their responsiveness. The plane obeyed the slightest movement of the hand. But Yakovlev had another position. Besides heading his own design bureau, he held the post of Deputy People's Commissar of the aviation industry. In modern language, something like a deputy minister. This meant one thing. He saw the whole picture. All projects, all developments, all plans. He knew where the weak spots were, and he knew where the opportunities were. When in the end of 45, the Soviet leadership set the task to create a jet fighter in the shortest possible time, several design bureaus joined the race. Yakovlev's main rival, the design bureau of Mikoyan and Gurevich. Artyom Ivanovich Mikoyan and Mikhail Yosifovich Gurevich. Their bureau also received the task. The same engine, the same deadlines, the same requirements. 2 design teams, 1 prize. The requirements were formulated strictly. The plane must reach a speed of at least 800 kilometers per hour, must be armed, must be ready for flight tests within a few months, not years, months. Imagine the scale of this task. To create a fundamentally new type of aircraft, from scratch, on a new movement principle, with an unfamiliar engine, in a matter of months. This is roughly like asking an experienced chef, who has spent his whole life cooking on a wood stove, to master a completely new kitchen in 1 season. Only the price of error here is different. The design bureau of Mikoyan and Gurevich chose the bolder path. They were designing a new plane. New fuselage, new layout, 2 engines, 1 in each side of the fuselage. Ambitious, promising, but slow. Yakovlev looked at it differently. He had an advantage that no one else had. In his factory stood the Yak-15, worked out to the smallest detail, studied inside and out, mastered in mass production. An airframe that was trusted, a wing that was already flying, landing gear, fuselage, tail unit. All this did not exist on paper. All this existed in metal. Yakovlev could go the long way, designing a new plane. A correct path, but a long one. He could go the short way, put the engine on anything and see what happens. A fast path, but reckless. He chose the third way. And it was this decision that became brilliant. Take what already works. Remove what is no longer needed. Insert a new heart. Fly. Sounds simple. On paper, almost elegant. In practice, it was an operation with an unpredictable outcome. Because when you take a plane created for one type of engine and insert an engine of a completely different type, you don't know in advance how the structure will behave, how the balance will change, how the tail will react. What will happen to those parts of the fuselage that will be near the red-hot exhaust? The solution did not come from complex engineering calculations. It came from a question that someone in the bureau asked almost as a joke. What if we don't build a new plane, but remake the old one? Imagine a surgeon. In front of him is a patient he knows thoroughly. Every vessel, every muscle, every centimeter. Years of working together. Complete trust. The task to transplant a new heart. Different in size, different in principle of operation, different in temperature. This is exactly how the work of the Yakovlev Design Bureau looked in late 45, early 46. Let's start with what remained. The wing of the Yak-15 transitioned to the new plane almost without changes. Wingspan, 9.2 meters. Shape, profile, mechanization, all the same. Tail unit, horizontal and vertical stabilizers also stayed in place. Main landing gear, no changes. The fuselage was kept in greater part. The pilot's cockpit, its glazing, the instrument panel. All this was familiar to any pilot who had flown a Yak-15. This was done intentionally. The more familiar the cockpit, the faster the pilot gets comfortable in the new machine. Now, what they removed? They removed the main thing. The piston engine Klimov VK-105, powerful, heavy, occupying the whole nose of the plane, was dismantled. Along with it went the propeller, oil system, engine cooling system, a whole complex of units without which a piston motor does not work. The nose of the plane became free. The fuselage in front became lighter. And here began the most difficult part: where to put the new heart. The jet engine RD-10 was fundamentally different in its dimensions. Length, about 2 meters. Diameter, about 80 centimeters. It was similar not to a compact piston motor, but to a large metal barrel with a pipe. And this barrel blew out a stream of gases from the back, with a temperature of several hundred degrees. Placing it in the nose? Impossible. No air intake of the necessary size. No space for an exhaust nozzle. Placing it in the tail means completely redesigning the entire rear part of the fuselage and shifting the center of gravity. The solution that was adopted in the Design Bureau was simple to the point of unexpectedness. The engine was placed under the fuselage, right under the central part of the hull, slightly shifted to the nose. Air intake, in front below, under the pilot's cockpit. Exhaust nozzle, in the back, under the tail of the plane. Visually, it looked unusual. The plane was as if it had swallowed a large pipe, and it stuck out from below. But it worked. The balance, after a series of calculations, turned out to be acceptable. Aerodynamics, tolerable. The design, realizable in metal. There was one more detail. The rear landing gear, the very one that on the Yak-15 was ordinary with a rubber tire, now turned out to be right next to the engine's exhaust nozzle, a few dozen centimeters from the flow of red-hot gases. The designers took this into account. The rear strut was redone, made of steel, sprung, without a rubber tire. Metal will withstand the temperature. Rubber? No. or so they thought. The plane on paper looked convincing. Calculations converged. The mock-up was ready. Metal began to be cut. And no one, not a single person in the design bureau, asked aloud one very important question. A simple question. An obvious question. The very one, the answer to which they all should have known in advance. What will happen to the structure? Not in calculations, not on paper, but in reality, when the engine works at full power. When the exhaust temperature reaches operating values. When the flow of gases will not be theoretical, but real. They received the answer earlier than they expected, and it literally came out in flames. The beginning of 46, the factory airfield. The first prototype of the Yak-15 stands on the concrete. Not flying yet, just standing. Mechanics check the fastenings. Engineers with notebooks walk around. Everything looks right. They give the command to start the engine. The RD-10 does not start like a piston motor. No characteristic sneezing. No first uneven revolutions. The jet engine spins up smoothly, and then suddenly, within a few seconds, reaches operating mode. The sound is different. Not a roar, a howl. High, even, piercing. The engine reached the mode. Thrust is there. Instrument readings are normal. And then one of the mechanics standing on the side saw it first. Below the fuselage, where the metal skin came closest to the exhaust nozzle, something went wrong. The metal was not just heating up, it was changing color. First darkened, then turned yellowish, then a characteristic reddish tint, which any welder will recognize instantly. The metal was starting to melt. They shut down the engine immediately. The engineers walked closer. The bottom part of the fuselage in the area of the exhaust nozzle was damaged. Not critically, the structure held up, but the picture was eloquent. The calculated temperatures and the real temperatures turned out to be different numbers. That was the first problem, but not the last. Upon the next start, a second was discovered. The rear landing gear, the very one that the designers redid into steel and considered a solved question, was still located in the zone of thermal exposure. The rubber tire was already gone from it, that's true. But the strut itself, its mountings, the adjacent elements of the structure, all this worked in conditions that were not foreseen by the initial project. During a regular ground test at an increased engine operating mode, the strut behaved unpredictably. Thermal expansion of the metal, combined with vibration, gave an unexpected result. Landing after the first taxiing showed deformation at the mounting points. Work stopped. The engineers sat down to calculate again. The solution to the first problem, overheating of the skin, turned out to be laborious but understandable. The sections of the bottom part of the fuselage in the area of the exhaust nozzle were replaced with heat-resistant steel. Not ordinary structural, special, capable of working at high temperatures without loss of strength. This added weight. A little, but added. Additionally, between the nozzle and the fuselage, a thermal screen was installed. A metal shield that took the main heat upon itself and diverted it to the sides. A simple solution, obvious in theory, but it had to be reached through the melted metal of the first prototype. The rear landing gear received a new design. They made it sprung, with shock absorption that compensated for vibrations. The mounting points were strengthened. The geometry was recalculated with allowance for real thermal expansion, not calculated. March of 46. The prototype is on the airfield again. Start again. The howl of the turbine again. This time, no surprises. The skin holds the temperature. The strut stands where it should stand. Thrust is stable. Control during taxiing is normal. The engineers looked at each other. Someone smoked. Someone made a note in a notebook. No one particularly celebrated. In design bureaus, it is not accepted to celebrate a solved problem. There, they just move on to the next task. And the next task was won. The plane needed to be lifted into the air. And here, by April of 46, arose that which no calculations can solve. Not a technical problem, a human one. Yakovlev hesitated. Consciously, intentionally, methodically, checked every node several times. He was a man who understood the price of an error, not abstractly, personally. Behind every plane stands a person in the cockpit, and this person he personally looked into the eyes before takeoff. But while Yakovlev was double-checking, a few blocks from his factory, in another design bureau, they were also burning lights at night, and their plane was also almost ready. April 24th, 1946. Early morning. Moscow region. At two different airfields, several dozen kilometers from each other, the same thing is happening. Mechanics work from the night. Engineers verify the latest data. Test pilots receive instructions. Coffee, cigarettes, quiet conversations. Everyone understands everything. No one says it aloud. Today, the first flight. In the design bureau of Mikoyan and Gurevich, everything was going according to plan. Their plane, the MiG-9, was a fundamentally different machine. Two engines, a new fuselage, a different layout. They built from scratch, and built it. Test pilot Alexei Nikolaevich Grinchik took his place in the cockpit. The technicians stepped away. The MiG-9 took off in the first half of the day. At Yakovlev's airfield at this time, final checks were going on. Yakovlev, true to himself, went over the checklist one more time. Spoke with the mechanics one more time. Listened to the report on the engine condition one more time. Test pilot Mikhail Ivanovich Ivanov waited in the cockpit. Mikhail Ivanovich Ivanov, by that moment, was a most experienced test pilot. Behind his shoulders, dozens of first flights on machines of different classes. He knew what it was to sit in the cockpit of a plane that had never flown. There is no romance in this. There is only focus, control, and readiness to act at any development of events. Ivanov sat and waited. Outside, voices were heard. Then, silence. Then the command. The RD-10 reached the mode. Characteristic increasing howl. Ivanov checked the instruments. Everything is normal. Gave the command to remove the chocks. The plane moved forward. Takeoff run. The plane's nose lifted slightly, and the Yak-15 tore away from the ground. The first flight did not last long. Ivanov did not set the task of investigating flight characteristics in full volume. The task was simpler and more important: to make sure that the plane flies, that it is controllable, that nothing unforeseen is happening. Nothing unforeseen happened. The plane behaved predictably. The cockpit is familiar, almost like the Yak-3. Reaction to control, precise. The engine, even. Ivanov made an approach for landing. Touched the runway, taxied, got out of the cockpit, made notes in his notebook. The MiG-9 took off earlier. Officially, the first Soviet jet plane to lift into the air that day is the MiG. The difference was several hours. This is exactly how much Yakovlev's double checks cost. And here arises a question that sounds provocative. Did Yakovlev lose? The answer, no. And here is why. The MiG-9 was an ambitious machine. New, promising, complex. But it was precisely this complexity that meant a long road to mass production, a long road to adoption into service, a long road to the moment when line pilots would begin to fly on it. The Yak-15 was different. Simple, familiar, understandable. It could be quickly launched into series. It could be quickly mastered. And it was exactly it, not the MiG, that became the first jet fighter officially accepted for service by the Air Force of the Soviet Union. First took off the MiG. First entered service, the Yak. History loves such turns. Now, when the plane had taken off and received an official status, the next question arose. What exactly can it do? What is it actually like? In numbers, in sensations, in comparison with what already existed in the world. The Yak-15 took off. Now it was necessary to understand what exactly took off. Let's talk about numbers. But not in the way they do it in technical manuals. There the numbers stand dead, just digits on a page. Let's try differently. The length of the Yak-15 is 8.7 meters. This is approximately 2 passenger cars placed bumper to bumper. A small plane. Compact. Light to the look. Wingspan. 9.2 meters, a little more than the length of the fuselage itself. The wing is not wide. It is honed for speed, not for load capacity. Takeoff weight, 2,704 kilograms. For comparison, a modern mid-class SUV weighs approximately the same. The Yak-15 was a light machine by any standards. Now, speed. And here the interesting stuff begins. The maximum speed of the Yak-15 at an altitude of 5,000 meters, 800 kilometers per hour. This figure requires context to understand what it meant in '46. The best Soviet piston fighter of that time, the Yak-3, reached a maximum speed of about 647 kilometers per hour at ground level. The Yak-15 was faster by 150 plus kilometers per hour. 150 kilometers per hour of difference is not just a figure. In an air battle, this means that you can catch up to anyone you want, and get away from anyone who wants to catch up to you. Rate of climb, 5,000 meters in 4 minutes, 6 seconds. Let's translate it into an image. Imagine a building the height of the Eiffel Tower, 300 meters. The Yak-15 gained an altitude equal to approximately 16 such towers, placed one on top of the other, in less than 5 minutes. The engine pulled upward confidently and without hesitation. Armament, one 23mm caliber cannon and one 12.7mm caliber large caliber machine gun. For an interceptor fighter, sufficient. Not rich, but sufficient. Ceiling, the altitude above which the plane cannot climb, 11,000 meters. This is higher than most modern passenger planes fly in cruise mode. By the standards of the late 40s, the characteristics were quite competitive. Not outstanding, but strong. A plane that can do what is required of it. And here we have reached the most painful place. To the figure that effectively determined the fate of this plane. Fuel reserve, 472 kilograms. Flight range, about 575 kilometers. Let's translate this into geography. 575 kilometers is approximately the distance from Moscow to Minsk, or from London to Edinburgh. Took off, arrived, and almost immediately need to land. No reserve. Why so little? The principle of the jet engine itself is to blame. A turbojet engine burns fuel significantly faster than a piston one, especially at takeoff and at high speeds. The RD-10 was, in this sense, gluttonous. It gave speed and thrust, but paid for it with large consumption of kerosene. 575 kilometers is a verdict for an escort fighter. This is a limitation for a long-range interceptor. The plane could not go far from the airfield and return. The combat radius was small. The designers knew this. The military knew this. Yakovlev knew this. And it was precisely this drawback, paradoxically, that pushed everyone to a conclusion that changed the plane's role completely. If the Yak-15 cannot be a long-range fighter, let it be something else. Something for which a large range is not needed. Something that is needed here and now, near the airfield. Something on which one learns. Put yourself in the place of a Soviet military pilot of the 47 sample. Behind your shoulders, years in the cockpit of a piston fighter. Thousands of flight hours. You know your machine as you know a close person. You know how it breathes at takeoff, how it vibrates at cruise speed, how it warns of a stall into a spin, with a slightly noticeable shaking of the control stick. You don't think about piloting, you just fly. The body knows what to do. And you are told, transfer. The new plane looks like the familiar one externally. The cockpit, almost the same. The instrument panel, familiar. The control stick is where it always is. Pedals, in place. You climb into the cockpit. Look around. Almost like at home. Almost. Because then the differences begin. And the first of them is before takeoff. Starting the engine. On a piston plane, starting is a whole procedure. Fuel supply, a few revolutions from the starter, first uneven flashes in the cylinders, an increasing roar, shaking of the whole airframe. A living process. Tangible. The jet engine starts differently. The turbine spins up quietly, at first almost inaudibly. Then a thin whistle increases. Then an even, high, unlike anything else howl. And that's it. The engine works. No vibration of the fuselage. No characteristic smell of the piston engine exhaust. The plane is as if it lives differently, breathes differently. The first thing pilots were taught on the Yak-15 was to trust the instruments, not the sensations. On a piston plane, an experienced pilot felt the engine mode literally through his back. Vibration, sound, smell, all this gave information. The jet engine did not give these signals. It worked evenly, both at idle and at maximum. The difference was only in the readings of the instruments. Retraining a multi-year reflex to listen to the body and replacing it with a new reflex to read the instruments is not a technical question. It is a psychological restructuring, deep and not fast. The second fundamental difference, acceleration and braking. A piston fighter responded to the throttle almost instantly. Added thrust, the plane immediately responded. Removed, also immediately. The pilot was used to this direct dialogue with the engine. The jet engine responded with a delay. Not seconds, fractions of a second. But in a critical situation, during landing, in a maneuver, these fractions of a second mattered. The pilot gave the command, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the engine responded. For a person used to an instant reaction, this required a complete restructuring of intuition. Landing the Yak-15 was a separate science. On a piston plane, the pilot made an approach for landing with a power reserve. The engine could always quickly add power if something went wrong. The jet engine spun up slower. This meant the approach needed to be calculated more precisely. Higher on the glide slope, with higher speed, with less right to error. Instructors noted the same thing in all pilots undergoing retraining. The first flights, tension, stiffness, attempts to pilot just like on a piston machine. The plane did not forgive this. Not rudely, not dangerously, but made it understood. Slightly deviated from the calculated glide slope, slightly lagged on the throttle command, as if it said, there are other rules here, learn anew. And the pilots learned. The retraining program was built gradually. First, ground training, study of the cockpit, instruments, systems. Then, taxiing on the airfield. The pilot felt the machine on the ground, got used to the reaction to control, listened to the engine. Then, the first solo flight. Short, without complex maneuvers. Just take off, go in a circle, land, and do it again. And again, and again. The Yak-15 for this task was ideal, precisely because it was a remade Yak-3. The cockpit is familiar. The pilot did not spend attention resources on mastering a new workplace. Behavior in the air is predictable, no unpleasant surprises. A simple and reliable design, fewer breakdowns, fewer unplanned situations. The plane was created as a temporary solution, as a bridge between eras. And it became exactly this bridge, for hundreds of Soviet pilots who stepped from it into jet aviation. A total of 280 Yak-15s were built. 280 machines. Each went through many pilots. Each pilot took with him to the next cockpit, into the MiG-15, into the Yak-17, into other jet machines of the next generation, that which this small and unremarkable plane taught him. And here is what is interesting. Among the pilots who went through the programs of mastering jet technology in the late 40s, early 50s, were people whose names the whole world later learned. Not all of them flew specifically on the Yak-15, but all of them belonged to the first generation of Soviet jet pilots, the generation that this machine helped create. Some of them reached the cockpit of a completely different apparatus, with portholes instead of a cockpit canopy, and instead of a runway under them was a fiery cloud of rocket engines. The Yak-15 did its job quietly and without extra words, as befits a good teacher. But before going into the shadow of training airfields, this plane managed to get on the biggest stage in the country, on a stage that millions saw, and not only in the Soviet Union. May 1st, 1947, Moscow, early morning. The city wakes up not as usual. On the streets since the night stand people with flags and banners. Officers cordon off the routes. Trucks distribute stands and loudspeakers. May Day in the Soviet Union is not just a holiday. It is a state ritual, a demonstration of power, a message to the whole world. On this day on Red Square, the entire Soviet leadership always gathered. Here they accepted the parade. Here they looked at what the country had done over the past year. Here they made it clear, we are alive, we are strong, we are moving forward. But this May Day was special, because something new was included in the parade program. For the first time over Red Square, jet planes were to pass. At the airfields of the Moscow region, the picture was completely different. No solemnity. Mechanics in working overalls. The smell of kerosene. Brief commands. Technical sheets with check marks. The pilots received instructions for the last time. The order of passage is strict. Fives of planes. First, the Yak-15s, then the MiG-9s. The altitude of passage over the square, strictly maintained. Speed, maintained. Intervals between machines, maintained. Deviation from the route or from the altitude is inadmissible. This is not a training flight. This is a political event. The pilots understood this. Each of them went through long retraining, through hundreds of hours on jet machines, professionals of the highest class. But on this morning, even the most experienced of them felt something special. Not fear, rather, realization. Now they will fly over the center of Moscow, over the Kremlin, over the square where hundreds of thousands of people stand, and over those stands where people in identical gray coats sit, those on whose word much depends, including their fate. The planes lined up at the start. On Red Square at this time, everything went its own way. Columns with banners, orchestras, speeches over the loudspeakers, Muscovites in festive clothes, children on their fathers' shoulders, the usual May Day picture. On the stands, a different story. Among the guests of the parade that day were military attachés from dozens of foreign states. People in uniforms with epaulets of different armies of the world. Their job, to look carefully, memorize, analyze. They did this professionally. They had seen Soviet parades before, knew what to expect. Piston planes, tanks, artillery. Everything is familiar, everything is studied, everything is entered into the catalogs of intelligence services. And then, a new sound over the square. Not the roar of piston motors, another. High, cutting, unfamiliar howl. A few seconds, and over the domes of St. Basil's passed the fives of planes. Swiftly, evenly, without the slightest deviation from the formation. The viewers on the square did not all understand immediately what exactly they saw. The planes flashed by quickly. Unusual sound. Unusual silhouette. No propeller. Someone looked at the sky with admiration. Someone with bewilderment. But on the stands with the attachés, there, everyone understood immediately. The Soviet Union showed jet planes. Not one experimental prototype, not a single copy. Line 5s. Synchronous formation. Serial machines. This meant one thing. Soviet industry mastered jet engines, put them into series, prepared pilots, and now these planes are in service. On the same day, May 1st, 1947, dozens of dispatches left Moscow to the capitals of different countries. Military attachés sent reports to their governments. The content of all these dispatches was approximately the same, although they were written in different languages. The Soviet Union entered the jet age. Moreover, it entered it in an organized way, seriously, without amateurism. This was an important signal in a world that was already beginning to build new dividing lines between major powers. The parade over Red Square in 47 is not just an aviation show. It is a statement. Technological, political, strategic. And in this statement, the Yak-15 played its role. Not because it was the best jet plane in the world. It was not. Not because it was the fastest or the longest range. It was neither one nor the other. It was there. It flew in formation. It was real. For the pilots who flew that day over the square, It was a moment that is remembered for a whole lifetime. Not because of speed, not because of altitude, because of a sensation that is hard to describe with words. When you understand that what you have been doing in the last months, long retraining, hundreds of takeoffs and landings, endless debriefings, all this suddenly found meaning in a few seconds over the domes of old Moscow cathedrals. The planes passed over the square and set a course back to the airfield. The parade continued. The square hummed. The orchestras played. And the Yak-15 already knew that its time was ending. It did everything that was needed. Proved that jet aviation in the Soviet Union is not a theory and not a promise. It is already here. It is already flying. Now the baton was to be taken up by others. 1949. The Soviet Air Force begins to receive new planes. The MiG-15, a machine of a completely different class. Swept wing, new engine, characteristics that make the Yak-15 obsolete in all parameters at once. The Yak-15 quietly goes into the shadow, not with a scandal, not with official statements about failure. Simply, they stop ordering new machines. They stop sending pilots for retraining. The planes standing on the airfields live out their resource and are written off. 280 built machines, about 3 years of active service, and silence. In museums today, you can find individual remaining copies. There are few of them. The plane was not famous. It was not kept as carefully as monuments of an era are kept. It was kept as tools are kept. And working tools usually do not outlive their time. Let's stop for a second and talk honestly. The Yak-15 was not an outstanding plane. It did not set world speed records. It did not participate in major air operations. It did not become a symbol of an era the way other machines became. Faster, more powerful, more beautiful. If you ask a person interested in the history of aviation, name the first Soviet jet fighter, most will name the MiG-15, or will think, or will say, MiG-9 probably. Few will remember the Yak-15. And in this is almost an injustice. Almost, because injustice implies someone's guilt. And here, there is no guilt. That is just how historical memory is structured. It stores peaks. It stores records and breakthroughs. It stores the fastest, the most powerful, the most daring. It stores the necessary poorly. And the Yak-15 was precisely necessary. Think about this. In '46, before Soviet aviation stood not one task to create a jet plane, there were two tasks. First, to create. Second, to teach people to fly it. And if with the first task, both the MiG-9 and the Yak-15 coped, then with the second task coped precisely the Yak. Because the MiG-9, for all its advantages, was a complex machine for mastering. Fundamentally new layout, 2 engines, different behavior in the air. To transfer a pilot to it directly from a piston fighter meant to create an unnecessary risk. Too big a step, too much new at once. The Yak-15 was an intermediate step, exactly of the necessary size. Not small, still a jet engine, new piloting principles, new sensations, and not huge. A familiar cockpit, a familiar airframe, familiar behavior on landing. An ideal step. In engineering and in pedagogy, there is a concept, scaffolding. When a building is being erected, scaffolding is necessary. Without it, you cannot do. But when the building is built, the scaffolding is removed. And no one remembers the scaffolding. Everyone looks at the building. The Yak-15 was the scaffolding of Soviet jet aviation. While it was flying, it was impossible to do without it. When the building was built, it was removed. Quietly, without extra words, as scaffolding is removed. But let's look at what was built with its help. Pilots who went through the Yak-15 and the first generation of Soviet jet planes became the basis for the next generation of aviation. They taught others. Those taught the next. A chain of knowledge and skills that began at a small airfield in '46, with the first flight of Mikhail Ivanovich Ivanov, stretches further than it seems. It stretches to the MiG-15, which Soviet pilots mastered quickly and confidently, because they already knew how to fly on jet machines. It stretches to the MiG-21, to the Su-27, to the entire line of Soviet and Russian jet planes that were created and mastered for decades after. Each of these planes stands on the shoulders of predecessors. And among these predecessors is the small, not fast, short-range Yak-15, the first jet fighter officially accepted for service. The first on which line pilots began to fly. The first that passed over Red Square in May of '47. There is one more moment that is important to understand. The Yak-15 was created from a captured engine, on the basis of an old airframe, in impossible deadlines, with errors and fires at the testing stage. It sounds like a story about compromises, about decisions made from desperation. But look at it differently. A captured engine is not a weakness. It is pragmatism. All the technical progress of humanity is built on borrowing, rethinking, and improving others' ideas. There is no invention that would arise in an absolute vacuum, without support on predecessors. Soviet engineers took German technology and made from it a Soviet plane. In a few years, they were already making completely their own engines. The school had been passed. The old airframe as a basis is not the designer's laziness. It is the understanding that time has a price, that sometimes a correct answer now is more important than an ideal answer later. Yakovlev did not try to create a plane for the ages. He was creating a plane for a specific task at a specific moment, and he solved it. Errors during testing is not a failure. It is a process. The melted skin became heat-resistant steel. The broken strut became a strengthened design. Each problem left behind a solution that transitioned into the next projects, into the next planes, into the next generations of designers. At the very beginning of this video, we stood on an airfield in the spring of '45. The smell of oil and wet grass, mechanics at the planes, the roar of a piston engine. A familiar picture, a picture of a departing world. Less than 2 years passed. The same airfield, the same mechanics. Only now in their hands are other tools. Another smell, kerosene instead of aviation oil. Another sound, a high jet howl instead of the living roar of a motor. Another plane. The world has changed. Quietly, methodically, without loud announcements. One small plane helped this world to change. The last Yak-15 was written off in the beginning of the '50s, without ceremonies, without farewell words. Mechanics signed the Write-Off Act. The plane ceased to be listed in the register. Somewhere on the airfield, silence came for one more machine. A good teacher does not wait for gratitude. A good teacher knows that his work is done when the student has gone forward, further than the teacher could have imagined. The Yak-15 did its job.